For over 600 years, millions of people have believed they're looking at something impossible. They believe this cloth once wrapped the body of Jesus Christ after he was crucified 2,000 years ago. Scientists have examined it with every piece of technology we have. Skeptics have tried everything to prove it's fake. Believers have wept and prayed before it. And yet, after centuries of investigation, debate, and controversy, we still can't answer one simple question. What exactly is the Shroud of Turin? Picture this. You're standing in a dimly lit room, looking at what appears to be an old piece of cloth. It's about 14 feet long, maybe 3.5 feet wide. The fabric is yellowed with age, stained, worn. At first, you might think there's nothing particularly special about it, just old linen, but then you look closer, and you see something that makes your heart skip a beat. There's an image on this cloth, the faint outline of a man, front and back, as if someone had been laid upon it, and this man, whoever he was, had been through something terrible. You can see wounds on his body, marks that look like they came from a brutal beating, injuries on his wrists and feet, a gash in his side. I'm going to take you on a journey through one of history's greatest mysteries. We're going to meet medieval knights and Renaissance popes. We're going to dive into cutting-edge forensic science. We're going to examine evidence that seems to point in opposite directions. And by the end, you'll understand why this single piece of cloth has captivated the world for so long. Right now, as I'm telling you this story, the shroud sits locked away in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. It's kept in a special climate-controlled case, protected from light and air, preserved with the kind of care usually reserved for the most precious artifacts in human history. And maybe it is, or maybe it isn't. That's what we're here to find out. The church only displays it to the public on rare occasions. The last time was in 2015. Over 2 million people made the pilgrimage to see it. 2 million people traveling from every corner of the world, standing in line for hours just to get a few moments in front of this cloth. Think about that. What would make someone do that? The answer is in the image itself. Because when you really look at the shroud, when you see the photographs taken with modern technology, you're looking at something that shouldn't exist. The image shows a bearded man, about 5'11". His face is peaceful, serene even, despite everything his body went through. Around his head, you can see marks that look exactly like wounds from a crown of thorns. On his wrists and feet, there are stains that appear to be blood from crucifixion nails. And there, on his right side, a large wound, precisely where a Roman soldier would have thrust a spear to make sure a crucified man was really dead. Now here's where it gets interesting. This isn't a painting. It's not a drawing. It's not even a photograph, though we'll get to that incredible part of the story soon. Scientists have examined this cloth under microscopes so powerful they can see individual fibers, and there's no pigment, no paint, no dye, no ink, nothing. The image exists as a kind of discoloration on the very surface of the cloth. We're talking about the topmost layer of fibers, maybe 2 or 3 fibers deep at most. Below that surface, the cloth is completely unchanged. It's as if someone took a piece of fabric and somehow burned an image onto it, but without actually burning it, without applying heat, without touching it with anything at all. How is that even possible? To understand this mystery, we need to go back in time, way back. But here's the problem. The shroud's history before the year 1353 is mostly blank. We have theories, speculation, some intriguing clues, but documented, verified history. That starts in the middle of the 14th century in a small French town called Lire. The year is 1353. France is in the middle of the 100 Years' War. The Black Death has recently swept through Europe, killing maybe a third of the population. It's a dark, difficult time. And into this world steps a knight named Geoffrey de Charny. Now, Geoffrey isn't just any knight. He's one of the most famous warriors of his age, a man who wrote books about honor and chivalry, a man known throughout France for his integrity and his deep religious faith. And Geoffrey de Charny claims he possesses the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Think about the weight of that claim. This isn't some random person showing up with a relic. This is a respected nobleman, a celebrated knight, a man whose reputation is spotless, and he's saying he has the actual shroud that wrapped Christ's body in the tomb. But here's what's frustrating for historians. Geoffrey never explained how he got it. Never. Not once. He built a church in Lire specifically to house the shroud. He had it displayed for pilgrims. But the question everyone wanted answered, the question that still echoes through history, he never addressed. Where did you get this, Geoffrey? Some historians think he might have acquired it during the Crusades. Maybe it was taken from Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital, when Christian crusaders sacked the city in 1204. There are hints in historical documents about a burial cloth of Christ being kept in Constantinople before it disappeared during that catastrophic event. Could that cloth and the Shroud of Turin be the same thing? Maybe. Others point to the Knights Templar, that legendary and mysterious military order. The Templars were dissolved in 1312, just a few decades before Geoffrey appeared with the shroud. Could he have received it through Templar connections? There's no proof, but the timing is interesting. What we do know is that when Geoffrey displayed the shroud, it caused an immediate sensation. Pilgrims flocked to the little church in Lire. People wanted to see it, touch it, pray before it. But not everyone was convinced it was real. The local bishop, a man named Henri de Poitiers, became very suspicious very quickly. He launched an investigation, and according to later accounts, he declared the shroud to be a fraud. The story goes that an artist had confessed to painting it. But here's the strange thing. This artist was never named. The confession was never documented. No one knows who this mysterious artist supposedly was, or when this confession supposedly happened. After Geoffrey died in 1356, his widow Jeanne de Vergy kept displaying the shroud, and the controversy just grew bigger. In 1389, another bishop, Pierre d'Arcis, wrote an angry letter to Pope Clement VII. In this letter, he called the shroud a fake and demanded that it be taken down, that these exhibitions stop immediately. Now, you'd think the Pope would either authenticate it or condemn it, right? But Pope Clement did something interesting. He allowed the exhibitions to continue, but he was very careful about his language. He said people could venerate the shroud as a representation of Christ's burial cloth, not the actual shroud, a representation. That distinction is important. It tells us that even back in the 14th century, even the highest authorities in the Catholic Church weren't sure what they were dealing with. But they recognized that whether it was real or not, people found meaning in it. It had power as an object of faith and devotion. So what happened next? Well, in 1453, about 100 years after Geoffrey de Charny first displayed it, the shroud changed hands. It passed from the de Charny family to one of the most powerful noble families in Europe, the House of Savoy. And for the Savoys, this wasn't just a religious relic. It was a symbol, a statement. It said, "Look at us. We're so important, so blessed by God, that we possess the burial cloth of Christ himself." The Savoys moved the shroud around quite a bit over the next several decades. They took it to different cities in their territory, showing it off, using it to enhance their prestige. And then, in 1532, disaster struck. The shroud was being kept in a chapel in Chambéry, France, locked away in a silver case for protection. One night, a fire broke out in that chapel. Picture the scene. Flames spreading, smoke filling the building, and inside that silver case, the shroud. The heat from the fire was so intense that the silver case actually began to melt. Molten silver dripped down onto the folded cloth inside, burning through multiple layers of the fabric. Thankfully, some quick-thinking clergy managed to get to the case and rescue the shroud. They threw water on it to put out the flames and cool it down. That water left its own marks, stains that you can still see today if you look at the shroud. The combination of burn marks and water stains created a distinctive pattern of damage. The shroud was then carefully repaired by a group of Poor Clare nuns. These nuns sewed patches over the burned areas and added a backing cloth to reinforce and support the damaged fabric. They did meticulous, beautiful work. And ironically, those patches they sewed would cause major problems for scientists 450 years later. But we'll get to that. In 1578, the shroud made its final journey. It was brought to Turin, the capital of the Savoy territories. The reason was actually kind of touching. Cardinal Charles Borromeo had made a vow to walk from Milan to wherever the shroud was kept as an act of devotion. The journey to Chambéry would have been incredibly difficult for him. So the Savoy family decided to bring the shroud to Turin instead, shortening his pilgrimage. And it's been in Turin ever since. That's why we call it the Shroud of Turin. For the next 300 years, the shroud stayed mostly hidden from public view. The House of Savoy kept it as their private treasure, locked away, protected, displayed only on special occasions for royalty and high church officials. Most people never got to see it. It became this legendary object, whispered about, revered from a distance. And then came 1898, and everything changed. Because in 1898, someone decided to photograph the shroud, and that photograph revealed the shroud's most incredible secret, a secret that would launch it into the modern age and transform it from a religious curiosity into a scientific phenomenon. May 28, 1898. An Italian lawyer and amateur photographer named Secondo Pia set up his camera equipment in front of the shroud. This was the first time in history anyone had ever been allowed to photograph it. Pia was nervous. He had to be. The lighting in the cathedral was terrible. He was using the technology of the time, big glass plate negatives, long exposure times, cumbersome equipment. He only had brief windows of opportunity when the shroud was accessible. He took several attempts. Some didn't work out, but finally, he got a clear exposure. He packed up his equipment and headed to his darkroom to develop the plates. And that night, in that dark room, Secondo Pia saw something that nearly made him drop the glass plate in shock. When he looked at the photographic negative, the image on the shroud suddenly became incredibly clear and detailed. The face of the man came into sharp focus, far more realistic and visible than it appeared on the actual cloth. Now think about what that means for a second. When you photograph something normally and look at the negative, dark areas become light, and light areas become dark, right? Everything is reversed. But the shroud image was already a negative. Somehow, impossibly, this cloth contained a photographic negative image, and photography hadn't been invented until the 19th century, 1,500 years after Christ, 500 years after the shroud first appeared in France. Let that sink in. If someone had forged this in the Middle Ages, they would have had to paint in negative. They would have had to create an image knowing that it would only look correct when photographed using a technology that wouldn't exist for another 5 centuries. The odds of that happening by accident are essentially zero. Pia's photographs caused a worldwide sensation. Newspapers everywhere published the images. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk about the shroud. Scientists demanded access to study it. Skeptics insisted it had to be a fake, but couldn't explain how. Believers felt vindicated. The shroud went from being a somewhat obscure religious relic to being front-page news around the world. In 1931, better photographs were taken during another public exhibition. These confirmed everything Pia had discovered and revealed even more detail. Researchers started noticing other strange things about the image. The more they looked, the stranger it got. For example, the image contained three-dimensional information. What does that mean? Well, the intensity of the image, how dark or light it was at any given point, varied in exact proportion to how far that part of the body would have been from the cloth. In other words, if you analyze the shading of the image, you could reconstruct a perfect three-dimensional model of the body underneath. Normal photographs don't have this property. Paintings don't have this property. If you take a regular picture and try to extract three-dimensional information from it, you get nonsense. But with the shroud, it works perfectly. This was proven in the 1970s when scientists working for NASA, the space agency, used something called a VP8 image analyzer on the shroud. This machine was designed to convert image intensity into topographical relief, something they used for analyzing photographs from space missions. When they fed the shroud image into this machine, it produced a perfect three-dimensional representation of a human body. The scientists were stunned. They had never seen anything like it. One of them later said that when the three-dimensional image appeared on their screen, everyone in the room just went silent, because this was impossible. How could anyone in the Middle Ages encode three-dimensional spatial information into an image when the very concept wouldn't be understood for hundreds of years? Around the same time, medical examiners and forensic pathologists started getting interested in the shroud. They wanted to know if the wounds shown on the image were anatomically accurate. Could these be the real injuries from a real crucifixion? Or would they show the kind of mistakes an artist might make? What they found was remarkable. The blood stains appeared to be completely accurate from a medical and forensic standpoint. The blood flow patterns matched what you'd expect based on gravity and body position. The wounds were in the right places. Everything checked out. Take the wound in the side, for instance. According to the Gospel of John, a Roman soldier pierced Jesus' side with a spear to confirm he was dead. The shroud shows this wound in the exact anatomical location where such a spear thrust would have reached the heart. Not only that, but the blood stain shows both blood and what appears to be a clear fluid, which matches what would happen if you pierced the pericardium, the sac around the heart. That's a very specific medical detail. The wounds on the wrists were particularly interesting. You see, throughout history, Christian art has almost always shown Christ crucified with nails through his palms. That's the traditional image we all know. But anatomically, that doesn't work. Nails through the palms can't support the weight of a human body. The flesh would tear. Roman crucifixion nails were actually driven through the wrists, through a space between the bones. The shroud shows the wounds in the wrists, in the correct location. This anatomical detail wasn't widely known in the medieval period. Most people, including most artists, thought the nails went through the palms because that's what centuries of religious art depicted. There were other details too. The shroud shows evidence of severe scourging, the brutal whipping that Romans inflicted on condemned prisoners. Forensic experts counted over 100 individual wound marks from what appears to be a Roman flagrum, a whip with multiple leather strands, each tipped with bits of metal or bone. The pattern of these wounds is consistent with two men whipping the victim from different angles. All of these details raised uncomfortable questions for skeptics. Yes, a knowledgeable forger could have researched crucifixion. But would a medieval forger have known these specific anatomical details? Would they have known about the wrist placement? Would they have known exactly how blood would flow from specific wounds? And remember, we still haven't answered the fundamental question. Even if a medieval forger knew all these details, how did they create the image? Because the image still isn't paint. It still isn't any known artistic medium. This brings us to 1978 and the most comprehensive scientific examination of the shroud ever conducted. It was called the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Everyone just called it STURP. This was serious business. 40 scientists from various disciplines representing different institutions with different religious backgrounds and different opinions about the shroud's authenticity. For 5 consecutive days and nights in October 1978, this team had unprecedented access to the shroud. They brought in truckloads of equipment, X-ray machines, ultraviolet and infrared cameras, microscopes, chemical analyzers, you name it. They took thousands of photographs from every angle, in every spectrum of light. They carefully collected fiber samples using special adhesive tape. They measured, they analyzed, they documented every single aspect of this cloth. It was an incredible opportunity, and they knew it. Some of these scientists thought they'd prove the shroud was a medieval painting. Others hoped to find evidence of authenticity. But all of them agreed to follow the evidence wherever it led. So what did they find? Well, first and most importantly, they confirmed that the image was definitely not painted. There was no pigment, no dye, no binding medium. Under powerful microscopes, they could see that the image existed as a yellowing of the topmost fibers only. And I mean only. The discoloration went down maybe 2 or 3 fibers at most. Beneath that thin surface layer, The linen fibers were completely unchanged, as if the image had never touched them. This was weird. Really weird. Think about it. If you paint something on fabric, the paint soaks in. It penetrates. Even if you're incredibly careful, even if you use the lightest touch possible, paint goes deeper than 2 fibers. It has to. That's how paint works. But the shroud image didn't penetrate. It existed only on the surface. It was like someone had somehow instantaneously discolored the top layer of fibers across the entire cloth without touching or affecting anything beneath. The STURP team also looked at the blood stains. Unlike the body image, the blood had soaked through the cloth, which is what you'd expect blood to do. They ran chemical tests and confirmed it was real blood, type AB. They found high levels of bilirubin, a component that increases in blood under conditions of extreme trauma and stress. Everything about the bloodstains suggested they were real, and that they came from someone who had suffered tremendously before death. Another strange finding was that the image had absolutely no directionality. What does that mean? Well, if you paint something, you leave brush strokes. If you print something, you leave press marks. If you scorch something with heat, the pattern shows where the heat source was. But the shroud image had none of that. No directionality, no indication of how it was applied or from what direction. It was just there, uniformly across the entire cloth. The team spent 3 years analyzing all their data after that initial examination. And in 1981, they released their conclusions. The shroud image was not the product of an artist. The mechanism of image formation was unknown. Unknown. That's what decades of scientific study concluded. We don't know how this image was made. After the STURP investigation, there was tremendous pressure for one more test. The ultimate test, radiocarbon dating. This scientific technique measures the decay of carbon-14 in organic materials, and it can tell you how old something is with pretty good accuracy. If the shroud really came from the 1st century, carbon dating should confirm it. If it was a medieval forgery, the test would reveal that too. The Catholic Church wrestled with this decision for years. On one hand, carbon dating could potentially prove the shroud's authenticity. On the other hand, it could destroy the faith of millions. And the test required cutting pieces out of the shroud, damaging it permanently. Finally, in 1988, they agreed to do it. The testing protocol was designed to be as rigorous as possible. Small samples were cut from one corner of the shroud and divided among 3 independent laboratories: the University of Oxford in England, the University of Arizona in the United States, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. Each lab also received control samples, pieces of cloth from known historical periods, to verify their methods were accurate. The labs didn't know which sample was which. They just knew one of them was supposedly from the shroud. It was a blind test, the gold standard in scientific research. The world waited. For months, people speculated about what the results would show. And then in October 1988, the results were announced at a press conference that made headlines around the world. All 3 laboratories had reached the same conclusion. The shroud dated to between 1260 and 1390 AD, with 95% confidence, medieval period, right around the time it first appeared in historical records in France. The announcement was devastating for many believers. If the carbon dating was accurate, The shroud could not have wrapped Jesus Christ. It was created more than 1,000 years too late. Newspapers declared the case closed. Skeptics celebrated. The scientific method had spoken, and the verdict was clear. Medieval forgery. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because as scientists started examining the carbon dating more closely, as they looked at the methodology and the sample selection, questions started to emerge. Serious questions. The first issue was where the sample had been taken from. The radiocarbon sample came from a single corner of the shroud near the edge. This was an area that had been handled constantly over the centuries. Every time someone displayed the shroud, they would have grabbed it by the edges. Every time it was moved, folded, unfolded, people's hands would have been on that corner. It was also very close to the area that had been damaged in the 1532 fire and repaired by those Poor Clare nuns. Remember them? The ones who sewed patches and added backing cloth? Well, the sample site was right near those repairs. Before the testing, there had been a protocol established that called for samples from multiple locations on the shroud. The idea was to compare different areas to make sure you were getting a representative sample. But at the last minute, this plan was changed. They decided to only sample from that one corner to minimize damage to the cloth. With hindsight, that decision looks problematic. What if that corner wasn't representative of the whole cloth? What if it had been repaired or rewoven at some point? What if centuries of handling had contaminated it with newer carbon? In 2005, a chemist named Raymond Rogers published a scientific paper that threw the carbon dating into serious doubt. Rogers had been part of the original STURP team back in 1978. He had collected fiber samples from various parts of the shroud, including from the exact area where the 1988 radiocarbon sample had been taken. Rogers decided to examine these fibers under a microscope and run chemical tests on them. What he found was shocking. The fibers from the corner area, where the carbon dating sample came from, were chemically different from the rest of the shroud. The main body of the shroud was pure linen, just as you'd expect. But this corner section contained cotton fibers mixed in with the linen. It also showed evidence of a dyeing process using madder root, a dye that was not present anywhere else on the shroud. Rogers concluded that this corner section had been rewoven at some point, probably during the medieval period. It was an invisible repair, done so skillfully that was almost impossible to detect with the naked eye. But at a microscopic level, the differences were clear. If Rogers was right, if that corner had been rewoven in the Middle Ages, then the carbon dating didn't date the original shroud at all. It dated a medieval patch. The labs had tested a repair, not the actual burial cloth. Now, not all scientists accepted Rogers' conclusions. Some argued his methodology was flawed. Others said he was biased, seeing what he wanted to see. The debate got heated, but Rogers' paper was peer-reviewed and published in a respected scientific journal. His findings couldn't just be dismissed. Other researchers pointed out additional problems with the carbon dating. Living organisms, bacteria, and fungi can colonize old fabrics and leave deposits of newer carbon on them. This bioplastic coating, as it's called, can throw off radiocarbon dates, making things appear younger than they actually are. Some pointed to examples of other historical textiles that had produced incorrect carbon dates. There's a cloth called the Sudarium of Oviedo, which tradition says covered Jesus' face. It was carbon dated to around 700 AD, but historical records trace it back to the 1st century, and it has blood stains that match the blood type on the shroud. So which is right, the carbon dating or the historical records? There was also the case of a medieval cope, a ceremonial garment that was documented to be from the 1200s, but carbon dated to the 1600s. Carbon dating isn't infallible. It can be affected by contamination, by the specific sample chosen, by how the sample is prepared and cleaned. Look, I'm not saying the carbon dating was definitely wrong. I'm saying it's more complicated than the headlines suggested. The scientific community remains divided on this question even today. And here's something that often gets lost in the carbon dating debate. Even if the shroud is medieval, even if it really was created in the 1300s, that still doesn't explain how the image was made. A medieval date doesn't answer the fundamental mystery. How did someone in the Middle Ages create an image with photographic negative properties, three-dimensional information, and anatomically perfect details, using no paint, no dye, no artistic medium of any kind? So let's tackle that question head on. If the shroud is a forgery, how was it made? Over the years, dozens of people have tried to recreate the shroud using medieval techniques, or modern techniques, or any techniques at all. And every single attempt has failed to replicate all of its properties. In the 1970s, an artist named Joe Nickel tried to make a similar image using iron oxide, basically rust, rubbed on cloth. He created something that looked vaguely like the shroud if you squinted, but it didn't have the photographic negative property. It didn't contain three-dimensional information. And under a microscope, it looked completely different. His image penetrated deep into the fabric, unlike the shroud's superficial discoloration. In 2009, an Italian scientist named Luigi Garlascelli announced he had successfully reproduced the shroud. He got a lot of media coverage. Headlines said the shroud had finally been debunked. But when other scientists examined his reproduction, they found major problems. Garlascelli had used pigments and acids. He had artificially aged the cloth. His image showed clear evidence of directionality and artistic technique. Under microscopic examination, it looked nothing like the actual shroud. It didn't have the three-dimensional spatial information. The image penetrated the fabric instead of staying on the surface. It was, at best, a crude approximation that looked somewhat similar to the naked eye, but failed every detailed comparison. The fundamental problem is that the shroud has properties that seem mutually exclusive. It's incredibly detailed, showing fine features of the face and body. But it has no directionality, no sign of being applied from any particular angle. It's uniform across a large area, but it's only on the very surface of the fibers. It contains spatial information about depth and distance, but it was created centuries before anyone understood such concepts. Some researchers have proposed that the image was created by radiation. The idea is that energy radiating from the body could have scorched the cloth, creating this unique image. This radiation would have gone out in all directions from every point on the body, which would explain why the image has no directionality and why it encoded three-dimensional information. But this raises obvious questions. What kind of radiation? Under what circumstances would a dead body emit radiation? There's no known natural process that would cause this. For some believers, this is where faith enters the picture. They propose that whatever happened during the resurrection, that miraculous event described in the Gospels, somehow imprinted Christ's image on the burial cloth. Maybe it was a burst of energy, or light, or something we don't have words for. Something beyond our current scientific understanding. But that's not a scientific explanation. That's theology. And while faith is valuable and meaningful to billions of people, it's not something you can test in a laboratory. So we're left with this frustrating situation. We can't explain how the shroud was made using medieval technology. We can't reproduce it using modern technology. The best we can do is say it's anomalous, unusual, unexplained. Let's talk about some of the other evidence that's been found on the shroud, because the image is just one part of the puzzle. In 1973, a Swiss criminologist named Max Frey was allowed to collect pollen samples from the cloth. He used special tape to lift pollen grains from the surface, then examine them under a microscope. Frey identified pollen from dozens of different plant species. Many of these plants grow in Europe, which makes sense given the shroud's known history in France and Italy. But he also found pollen from plants that only grow in the Middle East, specifically in the area around Jerusalem. Some of these plants bloom only during March and April, which happens to be the time of Passover, when Jesus was crucified according to the Gospels. Critics argued that Frey's methods were questionable. They said pollen could have contaminated the shroud at any point during its travels. Maybe someone who had been to Jerusalem touched the shroud. Maybe pollen blew in through a window when the shroud was on display. Contamination could explain everything. But later studies confirmed the presence of Middle Eastern pollen and dust on the shroud. And the variety and concentration of these particles suggested more than simple contamination. It suggested the shroud had spent significant time in that region. In 1999, a botanist named Avinoam Danin claimed he could see the impressions of flowers on the shroud when he examined it under ultraviolet light. He identified specific species that grow around Jerusalem. One of them, Zygophyllum dumosum, is particularly interesting because it grows almost exclusively in Israel and Jordan. Not everyone agrees these are actually flower images. Some scientists think they're just random patterns in the weave, and people are seeing what they want to see, like finding shapes in clouds. The debate over the flower images continues. Researchers have also found traces of limestone dust on the shroud. Chemical analysis showed this limestone was consistent with limestone quarried from the Jerusalem area. They found particles of a specific type called travertine aragonite, which matches stone from ancient Jerusalem tombs. Again, skeptics have explanations. Maybe someone deliberately added limestone dust to make the shroud appear authentic. Maybe it's contamination from somewhere else. For every piece of evidence suggesting authenticity, there's a potential alternative explanation. Then there's the question of burial practices. The way the man appears to have been wrapped in the shroud matches first-century Jewish burial customs, at least according to some scholars. Others disagree, saying the Gospels describe Jesus being wrapped with strips of cloth and spices, not laid in a single large shroud. It's exhausting, isn't it? For every argument, there's a counter-argument. For every piece of evidence, there's a different interpretation. That's the nature of the shroud. It's ambiguous. It refuses to give us easy answers. In recent years, modern technology has continued to reveal new details about the shroud. In 2011, Italian researchers tried to recreate the image using ultraviolet laser pulses. They found they could create a yellowing effect on linen similar to the shroud image, but only on a very small scale, a few square centimeters at a time. To create the entire shroud image this way would require technology far beyond anything available, not just in medieval times, but today. It would need thousands of precisely controlled laser pulses, perfectly coordinated. The researchers concluded it was theoretically possible, but practically impossible, especially for someone in the Middle Ages. In 2018, forensic scientists examined the blood flow patterns on the shroud using modern crime scene analysis techniques. Some of them concluded the blood flows were inconsistent with a body in the position suggested by the image. They argued the pattern didn't match what you'd expect from someone lying flat. But other experts pushed back. They said crucifixion wasn't a standard death. The body would have been in unusual positions. Blood flow would have been affected by trauma, by the specific way the body was handled during burial, by factors we can't fully reconstruct 2,000 years later. Computer scientists have used the three-dimensional information in the shroud to create detailed 3D models of the man's body. These models show a man about 5'11", well-built, who suffered extensive torture before death. The models match what we know about Roman crucifixion practices, including details that weren't common knowledge in medieval times. What's fascinating is that after all these years, after all this technology, after countless hours of research by brilliant scientists, we still don't have definitive answers. Every new study seems to raise as many questions as it answers. Some scientists are convinced it's authentic. Others are certain it's medieval. Many are somewhere in the middle, saying the evidence is genuinely puzzling and we need more research. The scientific community is divided, and that division has persisted for decades. The Catholic Church, meanwhile, has maintained a carefully neutral position. They've never officially declared the shroud to be the actual burial cloth of Christ. Popes have called it a powerful reminder of Christ's passion, a mirror of the gospel, an icon of faith. But they've been very careful not to make definitive claims about authenticity. Pope John Paul II said it best. He called the shroud a challenge to our intelligence. It invites us to go deeper, to think harder, to question our assumptions. Whether it's authentic or not, it forces us to grapple with profound questions about faith, science, history, and the limits of human knowledge. What makes the shroud compelling isn't just what we know about it, it's what we don't know. In our modern world, where we often feel like everything can be explained, measured, and categorized, the shroud stands as a reminder that mystery still exists, that there are things we don't fully understand, that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than we sometimes imagine. Over the centuries, millions of people have stood before the shroud. Each person sees something different. Some see the face of God. Others see an inexplicable artifact from the past. Others see a medieval creation that tells us about medieval faith and devotion. And each of these perspectives reveals something true about human nature. our need for a connection to the divine, our drive to understand mysteries and solve puzzles, our capacity for both deep faith and rigorous skepticism, our ability to create meaning and find significance in objects and symbols. The shroud will continue to be studied. New technologies will reveal new details. The debates will go on. Believers and skeptics will continue to interpret the evidence through their own perspectives. And through it all, that image will remain silent and mysterious, asking the same question it's asked for centuries. What do you see when you look at me? Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through one of history's greatest mysteries. I'd love to know what you think. Do you believe the shroud is authentic? Do you think it's a medieval creation? Are you somewhere in between? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the unknown, please subscribe for more long-form documentaries about history's most fascinating mysteries on Relic of History. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never stop seeking the truth.